welcome to At the Movies with AMC. This is our last discussion about classic Hollywood cinema, and today our topic is the rise of the auteur. Now, when we talk about auteurs, we're talking about directors, and I want to start by talking about one of the greatest directors of American cinema's golden age, who was, ironically, an Englishman, and that is Alfred Hitchcock. Now, I say ironically, but as we learned in our discussion of the Hollywood melting pot, so many people who were not born in the United States became fundamental parts of Hollywood's golden age. And as we will see today, a lot of the directors we're going to be talking about are people who were not born in the United States, but obviously achieved a great deal of success here in Hollywood. So I've read many biographies of Alfred Hitchcock, and every one of them mentions a story that he would often tell journalists about his childhood. And apparently when Hitchcock was just 5 years old, his father sent him to the local police station in their neighborhood in London and told the young Hitchcock to give a note to the policeman there. And so when the policeman read the note, he looked at Hitchcock and said, "This is what we do to naughty boys," and locked Hitchcock in a jail cell for a few minutes. And so the young Hitchcock was unsurprisingly terrified. You know, he was just a 5-year-old kid. And the experience left him with a lifetime fear of policemen and of breaking the law. And by the way, Hitchcock never knew what his father had written in the note, which I think added to his lifelong sense of paranoia. So Hitchcock, of course, grew up to have a long and illustrious career as a director, which spanned from England during the silent era all the way through Hollywood during its golden era, not really coming to an end until the demise of the studio system in the 1970s. So Hitchcock was really around for the whole thing. And the vast majority of the 57 films he made in his lifetime all share a very similar thematic element. An innocent man who is mistakenly thought guilty of a crime he did not commit, the same way that Hitchcock was unjustly put in the cell by that policeman when he was just 5 years old. And so the hallmark of all these films is what has come to be known as the double chase, where an innocent man has to chase the actual criminal so that the innocent man can clear his name, while he himself is being chased by the police who think he committed the crime that he did not actually commit. So in The 39 Steps from 1935, Robert Donat is mistakenly accused of killing a counter-espionage agent, and he has to travel to Scotland to find the band of spies that actually committed the murder in order to clear his name. And in Saboteur from 1942, Robert Cummings is mistakenly accused of setting fire to an arms plant during World War II, and he has to discover the real saboteurs to clear his name. In 1951's Strangers on a Train, Farley Granger meets a random person on a train journey, and that person suggests that they exchange murders in order to escape detection by the police. And it turns out that this random person is actually a psychopath who really commits the murder and kills Granger's estranged wife. And so Granger has to prove his innocence and convince the police that the crime was actually committed by a total stranger. And in North by Northwest from 1959, Cary Grant is mistakenly accused of committing a murder inside the United Nations headquarters in New York, and he has to travel across the U.S. by train to find and stop the real murderers, who are a band of spies who are stealing government secrets. So these are just 4 examples from across Hitchcock's oeuvre, but there are countless others. Hitchcock even made a movie in 1956 called The Wrong Man, in which Henry Fonda is mistakenly charged with armed robbery because of his physical resemblance to the actual perpetrator of the crime. And that film was based on a true story. So, what is the significance of this thematic unity in so many of Hitchcock's films? And how does it relate to the auteur theory, whatever that is? It's important to remember that a motion picture is the result of hundreds of people's work over a long period of time, sometimes years. And during the golden age of Hollywood, roughly from the advent of sound in 1927 to the development of the modern rating system in 1968, every movie made would be produced, directed, written, photographed, visually designed by different people, all working together as a team, but separate individuals. And this doesn't even take into account the enormous number of what are known in the business as below-the-line workers, the grips, carpenters, lighting technicians, makeup and costume workers, etc. The wage workers who actually do the physical jobs entailed in making a motion picture. So somehow, despite this enormous division of labor and this massive workforce involved in each film, Hitchcock was able to include his very personal paranoia about being accused of a crime he was not guilty of across the vast majority of his pictures. And even though his films were produced through the studio system's really almost industrial process of movie making, each one still bears his personal stamp. Now, as we discussed during our look at the business of Hollywood, during the period Hitchcock was predominantly working in, the Golden Age, this was also the heyday of the studio system. And during that period, it was really thought that the most powerful people in the movie business were the producers. And they supposedly had the most power because they found the projects, the source material, the screenplays or books that the movies would be based on. They were the ones who chose which studio employees would be used for each of the roles in production that we just discussed. And they were the ones who would shepherd each film through the various stages of production itself. So during Hollywood's classic era, there were superstar producers. There were producers who became known to the public. Men like David O. Selznick, who was actually responsible for bringing Alfred Hitchcock to America and produced Hitchcock's first Hollywood film, Rebecca, which won the Oscar for Best Picture in 1940. But in the 1950s, French critics at a magazine called Cahiers du Cinéma, including François Truffaut, who would go on to become one of the greatest directors of the French New Wave. Truffaut began to notice that certain directors had such a strength of personality that their personal stamp was evident throughout their work, like the thematic similarity we've been discussing in the films of Hitchcock. So Truffaut called these directors, whose personal aesthetics were able to transcend the industrial and repetitive nature of the studio system, Truffaut called them auteurs, which is the French word that means author, because he felt they exerted the primary influence on a film the way an author exerts the primary influence on a book. And Truffaut used a phrase, la politique des auteurs, which was then taken up by an American film critic named Andrew Sarris in his book, The American Cinema. And so this notion that despite the inherently collaborative nature of cinema, it is ultimately the director who has the greatest effect on a film, came to be known in Sarris's translation of Truffaut's concept as the auteur theory. So the auteur theory is the idea of a director's creative supremacy in making a film, and it has now become the overarching lens through which we look at film creation and production, really for the last 50 years. But it's important to remember that this way of looking at films only gained currency when the studio system was already in its death throes. It was only when critics like Truffaut and Sarris were able to look at the entire body of work of a director as a whole that they were able to see these patterns emerging across their individual oeuvre. And I think this is similar. We discussed earlier the term film noir, and I think this is a similar situation. You know, the term film noir was coined by critics in France, who I think were obviously much more stimulated intellectually by Hollywood films than American critics were at the time. And film noir describes a particular genre of dark and pessimistic crime movies from the 1940s and 1950s. And so now we talk about films old and new as being noir. But at the time of the peak of the genre, no one would have used that term because it hadn't been invented yet. So similarly, no director of Hollywood's golden age would have referred to themselves as an auteur because the term simply did not exist yet. Unfortunately, that is no longer the case, but that is a discussion for another day. So what constitutes an auteur? An auteur is a director whose films display a pattern of recurring theme, visual sensibility, and personal style, and that pattern can be assessed over multiple examples of their work. So I think in this way, the auteur is similar to the actors we talked about during our discussion of the Hollywood star system, in the same way that movie stars embody a specific, repeatable personality type that could be placed in a variety of situations and stories. Auteurs embody a specific and repeatable stylistic sensibility that can permeate the creation of multiple films in multiple genres. So a good example of a modern auteur would be someone like Quentin Tarantino, right? Though Tarantino's movies take place during multiple time periods and encompass multiple genres, you know, he makes crime films, martial arts movies, westerns, but they all exhibit the same sensibility. You know, thematically, they're obsessed with graphic violence and blood. Structurally, the stories are often nonlinear, jumping back and forth through time. Tarantino's scripts often contain lengthy dialogue scenes that are full of pop culture references. And visually, they incorporate tropes from Tarantino's beloved spaghetti westerns and grindhouse pictures. So they have a real 1970s look about them. And they all feature music scores highlighting needle drops of famous pop songs that are purposefully anachronistic to the action on screen. And in fact, I think, you know, Tarantino's sensibility across his oeuvre is so specific that now we refer to similar films and similar other cultural products as being Tarantino-esque. And this point where your name becomes an adjective for a certain style of storytelling, I think is conclusive proof that you are, in fact, an auteur. You know, another example would be the adjective Kubrickian, which is often used to describe a sort of cold sterility like you see in the films of Stanley Kubrick. So, who were the auteurs of the Golden Age? Whether or not a particular director constitutes an auteur is a concept reliant on individual critical interpretation. So opinions vary, but there are definitely some directors of Hollywood's Golden Age that I think are generally considered to be auteurs by the vast majority of film historians. One of the first would be Ernst Lubitsch. Lubitsch was a German director, again, born in Germany, but he came to Hollywood during the silent era after he made a series of very successful movies for UFA in Berlin. And during the golden age of Hollywood, he became famous for his sophisticated and urbane comedies. Films like Ninotchka, The Shop Around the Corner, and To Be or Not to Be. And if you have not seen those films, I highly, highly recommend them. Almost all of Lubitsch's films take place in a sophisticated, fictionalized European milieu, and all of his films feature what came to be known, even his lifetime, as the Lubitsch touch. And the Lubitsch touch was the director's way of kind of expressing maybe distasteful or sordid matters in a story in a very urbane and sophisticated visual way, letting the audience figure out what was occurring visually rather than saying it outright. Another great auteur of the Golden Era is Frank Capra. Frank Capra was born in America, but his parents were impoverished Italian immigrants. And so he grew up very poor, but rose to become one of the most successful Hollywood directors of the 1930s. It's a really sort of classic American rags to riches story. And his film, It Happened One Night, was the first film to win every major category in the Academy Awards in a single year. So it won Oscars for Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Screenplay, all in the same year. And that feat was not repeated until the great film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest 40 years later in 1975. So in his autobiography, Capra tells the story of how, after he had this incredible success at the Oscars, he had sort of a creative crisis, and he was actually laid up in bed with an illness when he received a visit from what he describes in the book just as a strange little man. And Capra says that the strange little man told him to get out of bed because he had a gift and he needed to use his talents and success as a filmmaker to promote positive ideas throughout the world. And although the story is probably apocryphal, Capra did indeed go on to produce a string of very successful movies that all celebrate the triumph of a regular man over corrupt forces, often political or economic, that seek to destroy him. It becomes sort of the overarching theme in all of Capra's films. These are films like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, and perhaps his most famous film, It's a Wonderful Life. These films were so successful that we now describe these stories of an individual triumphing over powerful forces against them as being Capra-esque. And so here again is an example of our surefire way of knowing a director is an auteur. Their name becomes an adjective. And just by the way, we often refer to things as being Hitchcockian as well. As I have mentioned previously in our discussions, Billy Wilder is probably my favorite director of the Hollywood era. And he is, in my opinion, decidedly an auteur, but he's an interesting one because his films cross many genres, from the gritty noir of 1944's Double Indemnity to the zany comedy of 1959's Some Like It Hot, and everything in between. But what unites his films is his uniquely cynical and sardonic sensibility. Wilder was born in Austria, again, not born in America, and he barely escaped the Holocaust. His entire family died in Hitler's death camps during World War II. And so this obviously created a very dark and cynical view of human nature that you can see across all of his films. Even the comedies are dark. And tellingly, before Wilder became a director, he started as a writer working for none other than Ernst Lubitsch, who, so he would have famously learned about the Lubitsch touch firsthand from the director himself. And in fact, for the rest of his career, Wilder famously had a sign in his office that said, "How would Lubitsch do it?" And he would look at that sign whenever he was stuck for an idea for one of his films. These are just a few examples of sort of classic Hollywood auteurs. There are many others from the Golden Age. John Ford made countless Westerns that all display a very similar sensibility. There's even more consistency across his films because he had a stock company of actors and often used the same people in all of his films, most notably John Wayne. Similarly, Howard Hawks, like Billy Wilder, made a variety of films across a variety of genres, but they all contain the same sort of rollicking world of macho men and tough-talking, powerful women.
What I came up here to tell you is that you must stop phoning me a dozen times a day, sending me 20 telegrams.
I write a beautiful telegram, don't I? Everybody says so.
Are you going to listen to what I have to say?
Look, what's the use of fighting, Hildy? I'll tell you what you do. You come back to work on the paper. If we find we can't get along in a friendly fashion, we'll get married again.
What?
Certainly, I haven't any hard feelings.
Oh, Walter, you're wonderful in a loathsome sort of way. Now, will you please be quiet just long enough for me to tell you what I came up here to say?
And of course, we've previously mentioned Hitchcock, who was the master of suspense and created thrilling and popular pictures for over 50 years that all display his personal sensibility and visual style. But it is also important to point out that there are famous critics who did not ascribe to the auteur theory. I mean, it's called a theory, after all. And I think the most notable of these was Pauline Kael. Kael was the film critic for The New Yorker, and she was really one of the most important and prolific commentators on cinema of the 20th century. And she famously wrote an essay in 1971 called Raising Cain, which argued that the principal author of Citizen Kane, the 1941 picture that many people consider the greatest American movie ever made, was not the director. Orson Welles, who now constitutes the paradigmatic auteur, but rather the film's screenwriter, Herman Mankiewicz. And at the time, that was, as the kids say today, a very hot take. It was not a popular opinion. And so not everybody believes in the auteur theory. And there are certainly Hollywood directors who had long and successful careers during the Golden Age across a multiple genre of films without leaving a particular readily identifiable stamp on their work. And probably the most notable of these is Michael Curtiz, the Hungarian director born in Hungary, who made such classic films as Casablanca, The Adventures of Robin Hood, Mildred Pierce. He made so many great movies, but they really are all very different. They're all incredibly well made, but they don't display a specific personality that you look for in an auteur film. And interestingly, Steven Spielberg, who I think most would agree is probably the greatest auteur of the modern Hollywood era, has said that he always aspired to be like Curtiz. He wanted to make films across multiple genres without any particular unifying sensibility. But I think we can all agree that the power of Spielberg's personal vision and talent is so intense that it permeates everything he does. So this is the last discussion we'll be having about the history of the classic Hollywood cinema. And I hope you've enjoyed this series. I really appreciate you taking the time to watch and listen. And now I will be happy to answer any questions you might have about the auteur theory or any other topic we have discussed over the length of this series. So I'm just looking at the questions, and someone asks, did any of these auteurs become famous only later, not during their lifetime? And as we just discussed, the auteur theory is something that happened after the fact. It was only after critics were able to look at all of the work of particular directors that they could ascertain the patterns within that work and ascribe the name of auteur to those people. There were, and as we also just discussed, in sort of the classic Hollywood era, the superstars were the producers, or the people who were kind of famous were producers. That gradually changed. We talked about Frank Capra's autobiography. The title of that autobiography is actually the name above the title, because Frank Capra was the first Hollywood director who contractually insisted that his name appear above the title of the movie in the credits at the beginning of a movie. And that had never been done before. And that sort of branded Capra's output as a particular kind of movie. We said how Capra-esque became an adjective. And so Frank Capra became kind of a brand name for a certain kind of picture. Similarly, Alfred Hitchcock achieved that status. And I think of all the people mentioned previously, Hitchcock was probably the most famous in his lifetime as what we now call an auteur. In his lifetime, that term would have been more academic and used by fewer people. But Hitchcock's name appeared above the title after a certain point. And what really made Hitchcock into a celebrity director was in the 1950s, he started a television series called Alfred Hitchcock Presents, which was a very successful TV show. And he hosted that TV show and really kind of played up his image as a macabre provocateur, director of dark, gory things. And so he kind of became a celebrity for that reason. He was a TV star, basically. And so in the later years of his life, he really was a brand. Hitchcock, a Hitchcock film, everyone knew what they were in for in that particular instance. But as we discussed, like the name of auteur was only applied to directors after the fact. So none of these people, while they were actually working, would have thought of themselves as auteurs. And apropos of Hitchcock, someone asks, many Russians know Alfred Hitchcock. What made his film special compared to the others? I think, so one of them is what we just talked about, that there is a standard sensibility of suspense that I think, there's a comfort in knowing what to expect when you go in to see a movie. And so Hitchcock, just seeing Hitchcock's name in a picture created a certain set of expectations that people would have about his movies that were satisfied. The reason all these people are celebrated is because they were incredibly talented directors. You know, they knew how to make films, and they knew how to make films well. And the films all exhibit a unifying sensibility, which makes them even more accessible. You know, it's kind of like if there's a band, you know, you like sort of classic rock bands, everyone knows that what a Queen record or a Beatles record or a Rolling Stones record is going to sound like. You know, there is a through line of their work, and that just makes it more accessible and more palatable. And obviously you have to be talented. You know, you have to make things that are good enough that people want to check out your content, your thematically linked content. But Hitchcock was, you know, just a master visually of cinema, but I think also thematically, just, you know, so good at crafting films that are scary but enjoyable. And you know, he's just really one of the greatest of all time, and always will be. Someone asks an embarrassing question for me, which is, do you know much about Russian cinema? Do you have a favorite director from Russia? So I do not know much about Russian cinema. You know, when I studied film, most of the Russian films we saw were from the silent era, because in the silent era, that was when, you know, the early days of the Soviet Union, Russia was really ascendant in the world in film culture and film grammar. And there was a previous talk where we talked about montage, and you know, Russians basically invented the whole conception of editing and the importance of juxtaposing images, and that putting two shots next to each other created a meaning that was more powerful than the two shots separately. You know, that the juxtaposition of images was more important, and that became the basis of all cinema. And I mean, that really was invented by Lev Kuleshov and Russian directors like Sergei Eisenstein. So when I was studying film, the vast majority of Russian films we watched were early Soviet silent films like Battleship Potemkin, and those are incredible films. I mean, there's a very famous sequence at the climax of Battleship Potemkin, the Odessa Steps sequence, and that has been parodied in, you know, Woody Allen does a parody of that in his movie Bananas. There's an homage to it in Brian De Palma's movie The Untouchables, which is a great crime movie from the 1980s or 90s, highly recommended. And that has a really specific nod to Eisenstein. So those films, those early Soviet silent films, Man with a Movie Camera, are very influential, I think, on American directors. And then during the sort of Soviet era, when Hollywood kind of becomes the ascendant film culture in the world, we sort of see less. And so the only sort of director of that period that I'm familiar with is Tarkovsky, and his films are, I mean, he's the epitome of an auteur. And his films are rightfully studied and lauded in the United States. I'm sure there are more now that I'm just unaware of, and I'm embarrassed to say that I don't have a greater awareness of Russian cinema, but I'm certainly a Tarkovsky fan. How did these directors help shape the image of America for audiences around the world? That's a great question. I don't even think it's necessarily the purview of these directors. I think it's just Hollywood in general, and just the portrayal of America has such an incredible had and has such an incredible effect around the world of just creating the impression of what people think America is. And in many cases it's realistic, but in many cases it's not realistic. Obviously, movies are entertainment, and things in America in movies are exaggerated for effect. And so it's interesting to me when I speak to Russians. I participate in a thing we do here called Conversation Club, which I invite you guys to participate in, where you can, we just have a Zoom call where we converse with Russians who are trying to learn English. And it's amazing to me, I live in Los Angeles, and it's just amazing to me how many impressions, when I speak to Russians about Los Angeles, how many of their impressions about America in general and Los Angeles in particular stem from movies and TV shows. And, understandably so. How else, if you haven't traveled, how else would you see? And so I think that in terms of projecting an idea and an image of America, cinema is incredibly powerful now, more so television and streaming. But just these visual media are the most potent way of expressing what American culture is like. And I don't think the auteurs that we're talking about in particular were thinking of that, thinking of projecting a certain idea about America or American culture. I think, they were just trying to make the best stories possible. And that sometimes involved exaggerating certain aspects of living in the United States. So these auteurs obviously did have a great effect on changing people's perceptions of the United States or molding people's perceptions of the United States around the world. But I don't think that was the purpose behind what they were doing. What were the biggest challenges these directors faced while working in the studio system? That's a good question. The studio system was, as we have discussed, basically a factory. It was industrial. And so there would always be meddling from the people who were ostensibly, on a set, the director is the boss. But in the Hollywood system, the director's boss was a producer, and the people who ran the studio heads, and all of those people had different ideas about what pictures should be and what should happen. And then during Hollywood's golden era, as we discussed in an earlier talk, there was an added level of pressure, and that would have been the ratings. There wasn't a rating system, but the Hays office and censorship. There was a code, the Hays Code, that established very specifically what could or could not be portrayed. And so directors would have fought with that, if they wanted to show anything that was sort of more adult in terms of depictions of sexuality or violence, or, there were just a lot of behaviors that were not allowed to be shown on screen. And so directors were constantly fighting against those barriers. As we discussed earlier, as part of the Hays Code, you could not show if two people were seated on a bed, one person's foot had to be on the floor, and that was just a rule. And so there are all these kind of absurd sequences in golden era Hollywood movies where a married couple is, kissing on a bed, but they both have to be seated on the bed, and it has to be obvious that one person on the bed has a foot on the floor outside of the bed. So those were the sort of, and then don't even think about depictions of, adultery or things that are more adult situations. And so Billy Wilder, who we mentioned in our talk, famously would in his scripts, write sort of outrageous scenes that could never possibly be filmed under the code, because he knew that he had scenes that were maybe violating the code. And he found that if he put in something that was obviously flagrantly not going to make it into the final picture, the censor would cut that and miss the controversial thing that Wilder wanted to be in the picture. And so that worked a lot. Like Wilder made a lot of movies that deal with adult themes, often in a very comic way, but he was able to show things that other directors were not, because he kind of gamed the system. So that would have been a whole nother set of challenges that these directors faced. But again, I think one of the reasons we now laud these guys as auteurs is because they surmounted those challenges, and they managed to make a body of work that has a personal stamp that really goes across all the films they made. Somebody asks, if I'm just getting into classic American cinema, welcome. Which film from this era would you recommend I watch first? I think we talked about this before. Casablanca is kind of maybe the most classic American Hollywood picture, and it's kind of got everything. It's you know, it's a moody black and white a movie that takes place during World War II, and it's about the war and illicit love, and it's romantic, but it's got a sort of political subplot, and it has incredible movie stars and Humphrey Bogart and beautiful music, and it's just an incredible American. It's iconic for a reason, and interestingly, apropos of what we're talking about today, it was directed by Michael Curtiz, who is not an auteur, who is just an incredibly skilled Hollywood director who made tons of pictures under the studio system, some of which are masterpieces like Casablanca, and some of which are completely forgotten, but he is not an auteur. There is not a distinct sensibility that runs across his pictures. But he obviously was an incredibly talented director because he made Casablanca amongst, we mentioned them in the talk. He also made Mildred Pierce, which is a really great film noir. He made The Adventures of Robin Hood with Errol Flynn, which is like an amazing action picture from the 1930s. He was a very, very talented director, but he didn't have that kind of aesthetic sensibility that is the hallmark of an auteur. Sorry, I'm just looking at the questions. Quick question, where did you study film? I went to a university here in the United States called Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, and studied cinema there. What surprised me the most while preparing this lecture? That is a good question. I want to give sort of a jerky answer and say, not much. Like, I was just kind of talking about films I know and love about, directors I know and love about. I mean, if there was anything that sort of surprised me, it was when I thought about trying to present, for people who haven't seen a lot of movies, the idea that there can be a connecting thematic thing across lots of different movies that take place in different times and deal with different themes and stuff can be hard to understand. And so I guess what struck me putting this together was how obvious that is. I mean, just Hitchcock, I've seen every sound picture Hitchcock made, probably the vast majority of them more than 4 times. And just that theme of an innocent person, they're all completely different movies, And some were made in America, some were made in England, some are silent, some are sound. But that theme of an innocent person accused of something they didn't do is in almost every single one of his movies. And it's incredible. You know, you're talking about a career that lasted almost 70 years. And every single one of his movies, with literally 2 or 3 exceptions, but a few exceptions, has that theme. And that is kind of, the hallmark of an auteur is, there's something deep inside them that fills all of their movies, no matter what their movies are about. There's an interesting, I didn't talk about this, but there's a really interesting thing in Spielberg claims to not want to be an auteur. But Spielberg's family history is very affected by the divorce of his parents, the relationship his parents had. And if you see his movie, Finding the Fabelmans, that's an autobiographical film about his parents. But there's a huge theme of missing fathers, single mothers, that permeates all of his movies. And I could have sort of done that as a thematic thing that connects a lot of his movies. So, I mean, that's kind of the hallmark, not just of an auteur, but of just an artist. A real artist is somebody who manages to inject their work with a real personal thematic sense and aesthetic sense. And that's what auteurs do. Last question. Do you think modern cinema is less creative than films from this era? I would not say that. I would say that modern cinema is so corporatized now that, it's something I think that's endemic in American culture now, is that, the imperative is to make money. That's always been the imperative. But, before the corporatization of these various cultural forms, the imperative was, if we make something good, then we'll make money. And that has just flipped to, we need to make something that makes money, whether it's good or not. And that's not a filmmaker's perspective. That's a business person's perspective. And that is now the overarching perspective. So that's why, you get the Fast and Furious 17 or whatever number they're up to, and Marvel movies. And, there are sort of corporate people, people with MBAs sitting in offices who say, well, this movie made this much money, so we need to make a movie exactly like that movie. So we can make that much money. And the people who make movies are at the mercy of those people, especially in the case of cinema. Cinema is just an incredibly expensive art form, especially with what people expect to see on screen now. It's very difficult to make a small movie about a small human problem. People want to see big stories with lots of things exploding and CGI and, superheroes and robots and monsters. And that costs a lot of money. And so, the forces that are able to provide the funds to make movies of that scale are not the most creative people in the world, And during the classic Hollywood era, it was very similar. Like, these movie studios were corporations, they were capitalist enterprises that wanted to make money, but they were only in the business of movies. And everyone involved in the business decision were people who grew up in the movie business and loved movies. And now, unfortunately, movie studios have all been swallowed up by these enormous corporations that make light bulbs and refrigerators and, do 1,000 other things. And the movie studio is just one part of this enormous conglomerate, and they just want to see, shareholder return. They want to see money, and so the primary impetus is no longer creative, and that is what changed. I don't think, my friends who work in Hollywood are incredibly talented, creative people. But their work is at the mercy of business people whose primary impetus is not creative. So sorry to end on a negative note, but that's my opinion. It's been so great sharing these talks with you. I hope you've enjoyed them, and please do yourself a favor, see some of the movies we've discussed, and I think you'll really enjoy it. You can't go wrong. Thanks again. See ya.